This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Listeners, it's been a weird summer, even for New England. Some days it's been oppressively hot and sunny, and on others, there's been torrential downpours. Some towns in Connecticut are still dealing with the impacts of last week's flooding. So even seasoned gardeners might be scratching their heads about what to plant and when. Given the recent surprises from Mother Nature, more and more we need our plants to be resilient if they're going to take root for next year, or make it into our vases or vases and our salads. Today, Charlie Nardozzi, horticulturalist and host of the Connecticut Garden Journal here on Connecticut Public Radio, joins us for the hour. He'll answer all of your gardening questions ahead of Labor Day weekend, alongside some other great guests with green thumbs. Plus, we'll learn about preserving trees around where we live and what goes into starting a commuting garden. Charlie, welcome back to Where We Live.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
And for our listeners, as usual, we would love to hear from you. Let us know if you're going to spend a long weekend in your garden, or if you have any gardening questions, give us a call, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. Or send us a picture of your garden. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Charlie, we talked a little bit about this earlier, that every time we have a conversation about gardening, it seems like the weather is doing something funky, and it's certainly been a very interesting year in the garden and in the climate. So can you start us off by talking about what's this gardening season been like for you?
Well, you kind of touched on it in the introduction there, hot and humid, and then occasional big storms. That's been kind of what the theme has been, it feels like, all summer long. That's been great for some plants. Some plants are thriving. I have, for example, our hardy hibiscus right now is in full bloom, and it's just loaded and it's huge because it's had so much water this year. A lot of hydrangeas, you probably have heard stories about people talking about how great the hydrangeas are this year. Well, They're called hydrangeas, hydra, for a reason. They love rain. So
I just connected that.
Good. So on some cases, it's been a great summer for a lot of plants. And other plants, I've been getting lots of questions from people saying their lilacs are dying, which of course they're probably not dying. They've just been defoliated because of all the foliar diseases. So it's been a mixed bag, as it always is. And it seems like more and more we have to kind of plant plants that are resilient in the environment, and just make sure we're keeping an eye on things and stay high, stay away from those floodwaters, raise your beds up and grow on the high ground.
Right. And so lots of flowers, extra blooming, as you've mentioned, with the hydrangeas and whatnot. Any other surprises that you've seen?
Well, I think a lot of the kind of the leafy, if you're a vegetable gardener, a lot of the leafy green plants that seem to have really thrived during this time. A lot of it is, if you can get varieties of plants that are disease resistant, you'll notice a big difference. And I noticed that this year with tomatoes, with squashes, in the vegetable world, but the same thing in the flower world too. There's a lot of powdery mildew out there, which is kind of a usual thing that kind of happens towards the end of the summer, but it started earlier, again, because of all the humidity that we have. So if you can have disease-resistant varieties of phlox and bee balm and some of these other favorite perennial plants, you're going to notice a big difference in your garden. I was just looking at some phlox today in our garden, and they look beautiful. They have no disease on them. They're full flowering, lots of color. And I'm thinking, and they're looking at me like, what problem with the weather? We laugh at the weather.
Well, I'm glad someone is laughing at the weather. And then this next question, it's kind of funny because we're still in summer. It's still hot and humid and all that jazz. But are you seeing any indication that the first frost will be coming sooner than usual? Because we did have a late frost during the spring, if I remember
Yes,
right.
and what I've been noticing with climate change and global warming is that our falls are getting longer and warmer. And so I really encourage people to plant for fall now, especially if you're doing annual vegetables and even some flowers and herbs, to be planting things in July and August, and even now, late August, for the fall, because we could go in some places to November, December before they even get a killing frost. You might get a little touch here and there, and you can always just cover the plants over. But that's been kind of a trend, more and more so. So I think people who've kind of given up on their gardens or thought that, oh, I'm glad the gardening season's over. That's been a pain. You've got another opportunity here to grow some plants, and it'll be a lot easier because in the fall things grow a little bit slower. There's not as much insect pressure on there. The weather is better, unless we get a hurricane, of course. But in general, the weather is a little bit cooler, so cool season plants really thrive.
Right. I am very excited for when the mosquitoes disappear because I do not have a very
Oh.
pleasant relationship with them. But so last time we chatted, the big news last year was that Connecticut is now a state of two gardening zones. Can you remind our listeners, what does that mean for planting in our state, and what does it mean for picking out, annuals and natives for the fall?
Yes, the USDA has redone the hardiness zone map again. I think it's maybe 10 years or so since the last time they did that. And now what they have found, because of what we were talking about with climate change, is that the zones have moved a half zone warmer. So if you were in zone, zones are 1 to 10. Yeah, 1 to 10. I have to remember with the range. 1 to 10, and then they're A and B. And so if you were in 5A, now you're in 5B. If you were in 5B, now you're in 6A. What that all means is that plants that normally would not survive in Connecticut may be able to survive, and that could be a good thing. You could be growing plants that are kind of marginal. I always tell people to take that with a little caveat because all it'll take is what we call a test winter, a winter where the temperatures really dip down. We get one of those polar vortexes coming down, temperatures dip below zero into the minus 10s and 20s, that kind of range, and that could wipe out a tree that's been growing or a shrub that's been growing and thriving for years. So you have to kind of take it all with a grain of salt as far as the hardiness zones, but it does give you an opportunity to experiment a little bit. On the flip side of that, it gives the opportunity for a lot of weeds and invasive species to be moving into Connecticut. And we're seeing that happening not just with plants, but with insects as well.
And then you mentioned a little bit earlier too that it's not too late to be planting fall crops. That's certainly something that you can think about. So, but if not, do you have anything that you would suggest for people who are thinking ahead a little bit?
Yeah, so you could do some fall things. Any of the leafy greens would be good. A lot of the garden centers and nurseries now are carrying transplants. I bought some locally myself not too long ago of things like lettuces and radicchio and arugula and a lot of these greens that will really thrive. But even if you can't find them, you can always start them yourself in a little container. Pretend it's spring again. Get those little containers out with the potting soil, put some seedlings, and you don't have to put them under lights, obviously. Put them out on a porch or a deck somewhere where they'll get some sun. Let them grow up a couple weeks till they're seedlings and then transplant them into the garden or into a container. That's another way to do it, real quick way. And you can get this real burst of fresh greenery in September, October. And of course, as we go into September, we start thinking about spring flowering bulbs, the tulips, the daffodils, the crocuses, the hyacinths, all those. Those, of course, you're not going to be planting now, but if you're buying them locally, this is the time to start looking for them because they'll get their shipments in late August, early September, and then that's pretty much it for the season. So if you want to get a good selection of those, buy them early, keep them in a cool, dark place in your house, and then mid to end of October is when you want to put them in the ground.
Well, you heard it from Charlie. It's not too late, friends, if you want to get on that fall crop/spring. And also, you can join the conversation and let us know if you have any questions for our guests. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. And so some people have gardens in their backyards or container gardens on their porches, but many communities in Connecticut also have community gardens. And joining us now to give us an update on community gardens is Coralie Benoit, who's a member of the Connecticut Community Gardening Association, also the board member and the vice president of the American Community Gardening Association. Coralie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello.
And so, I'd love to start, Coralie, by learning about how did you first get introduced to the garden and more specifically the community garden?
Well, I always have enjoyed growing things. And community gardening to me is the best way to grow things because you work with other people and you have a chance to learn because you could have a PhD in something and not know how to not know green up, brown down,
Sure.
or when to plant a seed, or that there's hot crops and cold crops. It's the kind of thing that there's an infinite amount of learning, and a good place to learn it is from someone who knows what they're doing. It also is community gardening is a wonderful way to revitalize the neighborhood that's struggling. And now with loneliness and depression as a very pervasive symptom in our society, community gardening is another way to combat that, because gardeners as a group are friendly, generous, patient. They have a certain level of kindness. So that if you join a community garden, you'll meet people that are worth knowing, you know? So.
Well, and we've had conversations with gardeners about how, there's nothing like the feeling of your hands in the dirt. You're planting something, you're creating something, both for yourself and for your community. Do you remember your first attempts of what sort of inspired you to want to be in that space?
Well, I think my first growings were avocado pits in coffee cans.
Nice.
And I have an avocado tree at the moment on my porch, which is about 8 feet tall.
Wow, that's amazing.
The previous one I had, it was a pit that I threw in the compost pile and it sprouted. So I had to put it in a can. I figured if it's got that much guts, we can't just kill it off. They're actually easy and fun to grow. I mean, in New England, you ain't going to get no avocados on your tree, but they have big showy leaves and they're pretty easy to grow.
Right. Well, if you're into the aesthetic, we're going to look into that, avocado pits in coffee cans. And I know you talked a little bit about, what drew you to a community garden. I think we're starting to see a lot of that pop up, especially in cities and certain spaces. And, I would drive around and I'll see a community garden. It is kind of, even though I'm not a part of it, like literally, but it gives me some joy, driving around, seeing some plants and flowers versus, concrete jungle. But you mentioned that sort of loneliness and depression factor, which I think it's a lot more common than I think people think. Can you talk about the role of what has it been like gardening in a community, and what sort of changes have you seen? Have you witnessed any evolution from your fellow gardeners, or maybe people who never thought they have a green thumb and they actually have a green thumb?
So first I want to backtrack on what you said, which is that you see them in urban places. And when the Connecticut Community Gardening Association started, we did a map of the 169 towns, and we made the towns with community gardens green and the ones without them white. And sure enough, the urban centers they were dark green because they had more than one program. But now they're in rural places, they're in suburban places. People start subdivisions and have community gardening as one of the amenities. They're everywhere. They're not just an urban phenomenon.
Right.
And I think people also are craving community. I mean, you can live in the suburbs and not have sidewalks and not be able to walk over to your neighbors to borrow a cup of sugar like you might have been able to do in an urban setting or in a rural setting where nobody's on the streets, So I think that it's something that now everybody sees as a necessary thing for humans to thrive.
Well, I especially also love a lot of schools have started to incorporate that into their spaces. Is that something that you're involved in at all?
I'm not directly involved in that. Connecticut NOFA has, they encourage school gardens. And the wonderful thing about that is kids learn that, lettuce doesn't come in a plastic bag.
Right.
And if a kid grows broccoli, I guarantee you they'll eat it. They start the vegetable suite that they start to consume is extraordinary once they've grown it.
Well, there's definitely nothing as fresh and sweet than a cherry tomato, I think, straight out from the garden. And we talked about community building earlier. Can you share with us more about that? What have you seen? What have you seen involved by working in a community garden? What kind of building are you seeing happening in there?
Well, one of the things about community gardening is it's truly community. And so you can meet people that you would never otherwise come in contact with. And it gives you an opportunity to see, I have a community garden in Worcester Square, and it was started by a group of grad students at Yale, and they understood the concept, but they didn't necessarily know how to grow things. And there were people in the neighborhood who had farming backgrounds, so it was great to see the local people knowing infinitely more than people who just read a book about how to plant something, for example.
Right.
So it's a sort of leveling opportunity, and you get to meet people in their personality rather than in their credential or their experience of this or that, and it can also be challenging because somebody in the community may have serious mental health issues, but you want to include them. We had one gardener at one time who really, I think, didn't understand the difference between a weed and a flower, and it wasn't because he wasn't smart enough. He really had a reality issue, So we had to support his gardening effort, even though he wasn't quite a gardener, But it makes you know that person, and if you didn't know them, you might be afraid of them. But there was no reason to be afraid of them. It was just, a mental health fear, kind of like a phobia. So community gardening can give you a chance to get to know all kinds of people in a way that makes you realize that we're all pretty much the same. Some of us have, degrees, and some of us didn't finish high school, but when it comes down to it, people are people.
Well, it's wonderful to hear that there's so many sort of cross-generational or cross-boundary friendships that are formed in community gardens. And for our listeners, let us know if you have a question. If you want to start a community garden, we have guests here who can answer your questions. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or let us know what your question is on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Quarterly, earlier we were talking about the insane weather we've been having, which I know to a certain extent is pretty typical New England, but there's been so much going on with the weather these days. Now, how has the rather chaotic summer weather impacted the community garden and the communities around there?
I think one of the biggest things is the insects. They have really thrived in this in the weather that we've been having, and people are dealing with them for the first time in some places. And in general, insects are good, but if they're eating your squash or they're killing your potatoes, you then take less than a happy look at them. So I would say that's the biggest thing, because the crops that people grow at the moment are pretty resilient to the temperatures that have been hotter, but the bugs thrive when the weather's better.
And also top of mind now is with flooding and with the historic amount of rain that we've been getting here. A lot of people are starting to put in or thinking about creating rain gardens and bioswales. Can you tell us what are rain gardens and bioswales, and what do they do?
Okay, New Haven has over 200 bioswales, and they collect the runoff from a storm instead of sending it to the sewer system, which is a combined sewer system. So in the past, before the bioswales, when it rained heavily, the runoff combined with the sewage and went directly into the Sound. Not a good situation, because it overwhelmed the treatment plant. The treatment plant can handle so many gallons per hour. But now New Haven has a system where there are little pockets in sidewalks, and they dig out the space. They put down some gravel, put down some webbing maybe, and then they put in plants. And those plants can tolerate both drought and rain. And those they can be very attractive if you keep them litter free, and they actually make a big difference in flooding and in pollution, because the water that comes off the ground is full of oil and animal waste and some litter. So it's great that gets caught in one place, and it drains more slowly than out of a pipe. So that's what a bioswale is. Walk anywhere in New Haven, you'll see one. A rain garden is more likely on on a homeowner's lot where you take the water from your roof and channel it into a depression, which has plants also that can tolerate both drought and water. And all of these things drain within 24 hours so that you don't have to worry about mosquitoes. Mosquitoes need a certain breeding time. It has to be standing water for more than 24 hours to have a mosquito breed. So a rain garden can be very beautiful, and you might not even notice it. But the homeowner knows that the water coming off their roof of their home, their garage, is not going directly into the sewer system, but rather into their yard. And that helps the trees.
Right.
I mean, that's great for the trees.
Yeah, mine goes straight into grass, but now I'm rethinking that. I think a garden might be a better way to go. And Charlie, really quick here, you've been listening to what Coralie has been sharing, especially in regards to community building that can happen in a garden. I think when we think about gardening, sometimes it can be pretty solitary. So what are your thoughts about the fact that we have these community gardens sort of blooming across the state and bringing people together?
Well, I think it's a great idea, and I've been involved with community gardens for decades, and it's always fun to see, as Coralie was saying, that it's a great equalizer. It doesn't matter what your ethnicity, your religious or political persuasions are, any of those things. You can always find a common ground in the garden. And that's really what I notice as far as the community aspect of community gardening. And also when we get people coming to the state, for refugees and those kind of people who are new and trying to fit in and trying to find a way to connect with the community. Again, everybody's got to eat. So growing food is a great way to connect with other people and share about different ethnic foods and different ways of cultures. So there's lots of positive things besides just growing some nice looking tomatoes in your garden.
Right. That's a bonus.
That's a bonus.
And Coralie, before we go to break, I would love to get some thoughts from you. If someone listening wants to start a community garden in their town, where can they begin? Oh, Coralie, I believe you might be on mute.
They can look at info at communitygarden.org, which is ACGA's communication tool, and I can give them 10 steps to starting a community garden, but I can summarize it now. First of all, you should start with a group. It shouldn't just be one person. You should have at least 3 people that are interested in doing it, because it's a communal effort and you want more than one idea. You want more than one person planning it. Then you need a location, obviously. You don't necessarily need dirt, but you do need sun. You also are going to need water. Water can be brought in or it can be created through a well, but that's going to be pretty expensive. So if you have several sites, the one closest to water is the best to pick. You might also need fencing. You should test the soil. Can you grow directly in the soil? Are there contaminants? Even in the country, there can be contaminants from an orchard could have arsenic in it, for example. And if the soil's no good, or there's just macadam there, you can build raised beds and bring soil in. So those are the beginning steps. Then you should get a group together that wants to garden and make some rules. There's thousands of examples of rules online, and you want the rules to come from the group. You want to have, are you going to have a picnic table? What are you going to do with the excess produce? Are you going to put it right out in front of the garden, or are you going to take it to a food bank? There's many different things that come up, and it's good to talk about them before they arise.
Do you mind just repeating the website for our listeners again?
Sure. It's info and then at communitygarden.org.
Well, thank you so much for that, Coralie. You've been listening to Coralie Benoit, who's a member of the Connecticut Community Gardening Association and also a board member and vice president of that association. Thank you so much, Coralie, for being with us this morning.
Thank you. It was fun.
And staying with us is Charlie Nardozzi, who's a horticulturalist and host of the Connecticut Garden Journal here on Connecticut Public Radio. And if you have a gardening question, let us know. Give us a call. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. As summer winds down, maybe you're not spending as much time in the garden, or maybe you are. You could be growing crops this fall, starting to plant mums and other autumn annuals to brighten up your yard. But here's the big question. Are you checking your trees? Tree checking is one other thing to put on your gardening list. That's when you make sure the trees in your backyard around you are healthy and not being impacted by invasive species. Joining us now to talk about tree checking is arborist and district manager for Davey Tree Expert Company, Cameron Pierce. Cameron, thank you so much for joining us today.
Sure, thanks for having me.
And with us still is Charlie Nardozzi, who's the horticulturalist and host of Connecticut Garden Journal. So Cameron, can you start us off by explaining, what tree checking is and why is August the time for tree checking?
Well, according to the Invasive Species Council, August is actually Tree Check Month. It's a little bit behind the mark. August is the end of the summer when the trees have exhausted themselves through the heat of the summer, not enough rain or too much rain like this year, or drought as in years past. And it's unfortunately a good time when you're going to start to see all the symptoms or things that have happened from previous months or even previous years, invasive pests attacking them. You could see dieback in the crowns, dead or damaged limbs, decay pockets in trees, or quite frankly, the invasive insects themselves, some that are large enough to actually spot with the naked eye. But August is just a time to really get out and perhaps prepare yourself for the coming season.
Well, and we talked about invasive species a little bit earlier, too, when it comes to gardening. Can you talk about what do they look like? What are we looking for?
In terms of the invasive insects, that is?
Yes.
Well, there's several in this area. And obviously they weren't naturally in this area. That's why they're invasive, and they have no natural predators. Like we were saying earlier too, there's beneficial, there's also non-beneficial insects. Emerald ash borer is a very popular one. It started in Connecticut around 2013, and it's still around. It's sort of migrating out, but that's a very large insect, green in color, emerald. There's many species of bark borers. Some of those are microscopic and hard to see. There is hemlock woolly adelgid. I think everybody's familiar with that. That's pretty much host specific. A lot of these invasive insects, they are host specific, meaning they only attack one species of trees. Spotted lanternfly is making its way up the coast of Connecticut. That's now, I believe, along the 95 corridor, right around the Milford, Connecticut area. And that's actually it's a very attractive looking insect. It's sort of spotted with red wings and black dots on its wings. But those are sort of the common ones in this area.
And so what do we do when we realize that we have these invasive insects on our trees or in our gardens? What are some treatments that we can do?
There's a couple ways to approach it. If you're starting from scratch, ideally, and you're planting, in a municipal or residential setting, you want to plant a variety of different trees and shrubs. You don't want to have what's called a monoculture. But like you just said, if you already have this landscape that you sort of inherited, or that now for whatever reason you're taking care of, you want to first of all get the plants inspected by a licensed arborist, and if appropriate, there are treatments, some organic, some not, and you always want to balance the equation of pesticide output versus plant damage. What I usually tell clients is right around 5 to 10% plant damage. If it's doing more than that, then it's appropriate to treat it with a pesticide, and you always want to use least toxic means of control.
Can you also explain, how are these invasive species sort of coming in? Where are they coming from?
Well, mostly due to the importing and exporting business. They're typically found around major ports or large cities. So they come in on trucks, either from overseas or from up north to neighboring countries. They could transport on trucks too. Some are windborne, but mostly generally through the importing and exporting business of goods.
And can you also talk about, we're talking about tree checking and the importance of tree checking. What is the impact of losing trees? Are we seeing that impact already?
I think so. Yeah, as a species, if you go back, a century or so, there was Dutch elm disease back in the 20s that essentially wiped out all of our elm trees. There was chestnut blight, which wiped out our chestnut trees. Now we're dealing with emerald ash borer, and it's not an invasive insect, but there's a new disease, beech leaf disease, that's wiping out our beech trees. So these trees will regenerate. But in terms of, a lifetime of a human, you could see these species go away for a few generations and then come back again, hopefully.
And Charlie, can you respond to what we've heard so far from Cameron around tree checking and also these international traveler invasive species that we're seeing in our region?
Yeah, it can get pretty overwhelming, I think, for a homeowner when especially if they have a tree that's been in their yard for years, if not
Right.
decades, all of a sudden start seeing dieback, the crown dieback, as Cameron was saying, and other kinds of problems with them. But I think it is good to get professionals in to take a look at them. People sometimes go online and figure out, oh, this is that insect or this is that disease, I'll just spray this. But a lot of the times it's about the timing and the application methods, and that's going to make it most effective. So if you have a tree that's a valuable piece of your property, it's worth investing in because you've probably spent a lot of money to get it in there, and to replace that tree is either going to take a lot of money or a lot of time. So it's worth getting some professionals in.
And are you seeing anything in particular regarding to pests and diseases in the garden this year? I know you mentioned earlier you've seen a lot more powdery mildew, which puts blight on tomatoes and
Mhm.
whatnots. And we're just hearing about, or we have been hearing about these various invasive species. Anything else that you've been seeing that's been sort of extra problematic this year?
Well, a lot of fungal foliar diseases, and it's on everything from your vegetables, the flowers, the trees and shrubs. I mentioned lilac blight, which is a fungal blight. You're seeing a lot of that where the lilac leaves are looking scorched and then they just drop. And so people are kind of panicking like, oh, I'm losing my lilacs. But as long as you can clean up all those dead leaves, try to get that inoculum out of the area so it won't come back as prevalently next year, and make sure there's good airflow around your plants. And also check, just take a hand pruner and just cut small little branches to see if it's green inside. If it's green, green is good. So if the branches are still good, even though the plant might have defoliated here in late August, it's probably going to come back and be okay for next year.
And I think another popular pest, I think for some, especially for me, is mosquitoes. And is that something that you're laughing?
You got a thing with mosquitoes.
I do have a thing with mosquitoes because I get really bad bites. It's I want to say it's not them, but it's totally them this time. Is that something that you're seeing that's been particularly bad? Because I believe last summer season it was pretty bad for a lot of us, but it seems like this year might be a little calmer. What are you seeing?
Well, it's all about the weather with mosquitoes. We have a lot of wetness and humidity and standing water, like Corley was saying
Right.
before, you're going to get a lot of mosquito breeding. So depending on where you live and the weather we're getting, that's going to be really the determining factor. If you have a pond or if you have some standing water on your property that's part of your property, part of the ornamental characteristics, there are things you can put in that pond that will prevent the mosquitoes from breeding and from hatching. And they're organic products. One of them is Bacillus, a bacteria called mosquito dunks, I think is what it is. It looks like a little donut. You just stick it in the pond and it'll kill the larvae that are in the pond. So you'll get less mosquitoes that way. And of course, if you can clean out any buckets you have around or any places where there's standing water, that's going to help too. But as far as like planting those citronella geraniums and things of that you hear people doing, they're not going to do any good for keeping the mosquitoes away. Unless you take the leaves and rub it all over your body, then maybe that might work. But that wouldn't be that much fun.
Yeah, you kind of squashed my plans for that last time, so no, will not be doing that. But I mean, what other advice do you have for our listeners in regards to combating pests and invasives and other creatures and things that we may find them to be cute or interesting, but you do not want them to be in your garden?
Yes, exactly. So I think, as I mentioned before, looking for resistant varieties, that really helps. For an edible garden, a vegetable garden, I've been using a lot of plant covers. So these could be floating row covers, which is kind of like a cloth fleece-like material that lets the sun in, lets the water in, but it'll block insects from getting in there. There's another one that's even heavier duty called micro mesh, and it's kind of like a flexible window screen. And you just place that over plants, and there's a lot of vegetables where you can grow them, and they don't need cross-pollination. So everything like leafy greens, the root crops, the brassicas, the broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, those kind of plants, root crops I've mentioned. they don't need cross-pollination from insects. So you can literally grow them to maturity underneath these covers. And by having that, you're preventing insects getting in there and laying eggs and starting having caterpillars or other kinds of problems that you normally would have. And it allows you not to have to spray as much too.
And Cameron, is this a good time to plant trees if people are thinking about doing that, or is there a better season for it?
Just about. I'd wait probably a few weeks. You want things to cool down a little bit. Although, if you look at the long range forecast, which sometimes can be unpredictable, now might be okay as long as the temperatures aren't going to spike because there's so much moisture in the ground, which is great for the person doing it. It means you don't have to water as much.
Are there specific trees that people should be looking out for to plant in these various regions, or?
There is a list of trees. There's a list that you can find online called the Fall Dig Hazard List. And there's certain trees that don't like to be planted in the fall. And by planting, I mean actually dug up from a nursery and planted in the ground. If they're already dug and they've been sitting in that nursery for the entire season, that's okay. But yeah, other than that, in a couple of weeks, it's a great time to plant.
And anything that listeners should look out for in regards to invasive impacting trees?
You want to check if you're in search of a particular type of plant, I would just look up what might affect that plant because a lot of these invasive insects are opportunistic. So they attack stressed trees, and a huge stress on a tree is digging it up and putting it somewhere else.
We don't want any stressed trees.
Right.
Got it. Thank you so much for that. You've been listening to Cameron Pierce, who's an arborist and district manager for the Davey Tree Expert Company. Thank you so much, Cameron, for being with us today and giving all these awesome tips about tree planting and tree checking.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And staying with us is Charlie Nardozzi, who's a horticulturalist and host of the Connecticut Garden Journal. Let us know if you have a gardening question. Give us a call, or if you have any crops that you've planted that you want to share with us, send us your pictures. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Our guest for the hour is Charlie Nardozzi, who's the horticulturalist and host of Connecticut Garden Journal here on Connecticut Public Radio. And he's here to answer all of our gardening questions and yours. So don't delay. Pick up that phone, join the conversation, 888-720-9677. Or if you feel like sending us a photo of your garden, find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live because we would love to see it. So, Charlie, we've been talking a lot about weather changes impacting the garden in various ways. Do you have any tips or just thoughts about your own experiences dealing with this? For so many years. Any shocks? Any surprises? Or you're just like, this is fairly typical, new normal type of thing?
Well, some of it's typical, and some of it is a drastic change, and is something that, as a person who's gardening, who spends a lot of time and energy and enthusiasm in the spring to get the plants and put them in the ground and nurture them and have them grow up, and then to have a huge rainstorm come through or windstorm come through or drought come through, whatever it is year to year, and destroy a lot of those things or knock them down, it gets very frustrating. So I've really kind of moved more into the mode of doing, I'd like to protect all my plants and with a big cover. That's my dream, a dome over the garden, right? Because that might be the only way to really protect them. But to grow plants, a diversity of plants, grow plants that are adapted to this area, grow them in different spots. So you might think of yourself as a vegetable gardener, so you have a vegetable garden, but think of planting them in other places too. Mix them in with some flowers around some plants, or even part shade-loving vegetables that can grow under trees, for example, that have some light coming underneath the canopy or underneath the lower branches, or in raised beds and containers. Having plants in different locations kind of ensures that something's going to survive. If you have them all in one spot and that area gets flooded, then you've lost it for the season. So trying different locations in your yard, covering them over, as I was mentioning about the insects, but also for weather. I've noticed that it really helps, especially when you get hailstorms and things of that nature. It protects that plant from having some damage that'll be going on. And just using a variety of different plants. Diversity is really key to try to have a healthy garden.
Well, we're going to take a quick call here from Marcia, who I think would appreciate your dome idea of protecting her plants. Marcia is calling in from Long Island. Marcia, you're on the air.
Hi, good morning. Yes, thank you for taking my call. Charlie, this has really got me upset because I love all the creatures in the garden. We need them all, and God bless them. But I have a beautiful blackberry bush, and it was loaded with flowers, and then the fruit started to, ripen up, and I think I got about 3 berries off the bush, and then boom, everything was gone. So it's funny because you were just talking about this dome thing, and I'm thinking to myself, what would I do to protect this bush so I could at least enjoy some of the fruit myself?
Well, thank you so much, Marcia, for calling in. I think your concerns are many people's concerns. I have some groundhogs that I deal with, and I think they're adorable, but they really should not be around, right, Charlie? So besides our fantasy of a gigantic dome that we can protect our blackberries and we can have more than 3 of them at a time, any other suggestions you have for Marcia and others who have the same problem?
Well, Marcia, I guess you have to first of all figure out what it is that's eating all your blackberries. Most likely it's birds. I mean, bears and other animals might come in, but you'd really notice the damage if that was happening. They would destroy the whole patch. But birds will come in and then they'll take off the berries as they need them. Squirrels is another one that'll do that. I think one of the things, not a dome, but at least netting that we put over a lot of plants. And we do a lot of bird netting and a lot of deer netting on plants. And so if you have a row of blackberries, what you might consider for next year is get some of those stakes. So it could be wooden stakes, but I get these green plastic coated metal stakes that are about 7 feet tall. I stick them in the ground and I put old tennis balls on the top of them and then drape the netting over them. So you're basically creating a cage. And the cage is big enough so that you can open it up and get in there and pick, but it also keeps the birds and sometimes the squirrels too. I've noticed the squirrels, if they're really hungry, they'll eat through a netting, but I've noticed that kind of keeps them away, especially if you do it early in the season. Like you're saying, when they're flowering, that would be the time to put some kind of cage or protection around that plant. And that would go true for everything from blueberries to cherries to plums to apples, whatever you might have as far as fruit that or birds and other creatures might want to get.
I'm going to take another call here from Soraya, who is calling in from Wallingford, who has a question. Go ahead, Soraya.
Hi. Thank you for a great radio show. I'm big time fan of you and also Charlie. We got a cabin up in Vermont in Woodford, and the weather is pretty extreme. It gets really cold, sometimes -20, and summertime is not very hot. But I do like to put something in the garden dedicated to our pandemic bird. She passed away in January, and I just want to do something nice for her. I like something colorful and hardy, so I'm not sure what Charlie has for me. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that call, Soraya. So colorful for the garden dedicated to a parakeet in Vermont. Any ideas, Charlie?
Oh, sure. There's lots of plants, even in Woodford, in a cold area, that would grow well and would remind you of that parrot year after year. So I would look for something that'd be long-lived, like the lilacs, for example, would be one that comes to mind. Peonies is another one, another flower that would be there for decades, and both very hardy plants. Any of the daylily family does really well. So there's a number of things. You can even plant a tree. It's always a nice thing to do, plant a tree, and there's some really hardy species that you can plant, everything from an Amelanchier or a serviceberry, which is a smaller tree, all the way up to a maple tree if you want to do that. So yes, there's a number of different things. It's really about what does the parakeet remind you of? What kind of plant, the coloring or whatever it is, and maybe try to make that connection so you can think of that bird every time you look at the plant.
I love that so much. I mean, here we love happy plants, happy trees. We also like happy birds. So we appreciate that question very much. And also here's another question from Marty, who is commenting from Waterbury. And Marty would like to know, what's the best treatment for black spots on rose bushes?
Oh, yes. So black spot is another one of those fungal diseases that you're seeing a lot of this year in roses. unless they're one of those resistant varieties. Like a lot of the new landscape roses, the Knockout series, for example, are resistant to a lot of those diseases. But if you have some of the old-fashioned ones or the hybrid tea roses, you're going to get those kinds of diseases. The thing about foliar diseases, especially the fungal ones, is that the best treatment is a prevention. So to spray before the disease starts. And so that kind of means you're going to have to anticipate the summer as it's going along. But as soon as those leaves come out and they start opening up, and if you're looking at the weather and it looks like it's going to be another stretch of warm, rainy weather, then you might want to start spraying. And the things you can spray to control the black spot on the roses will be some copper and sulfur sprays. BioNeem is another one that people will use sometimes. You can even make a little home remedy that will work as long as you reapply it regularly, made from baking soda. A tablespoon of baking soda and a gallon of water with a little dash of liquid soap. Spray that on the leaves, and what it does is change the pH of those leaves so that fungal spore doesn't really germinate. So there are a number of things to do, but you got to do them early enough to prevent the disease from getting started.
And so, as we look ahead at the fall and the winter, I think a lot of us like to bring a little green inside, have a little life in the house, and I love my houseplants when I can keep them alive. So, for our fellow houseplant lovers, what are some of your favorite houseplants and succulents to keep in the home? Especially for those who kind of want to start a newbie garden in the house, or just have no idea where to begin.
Well, one of the things you could do this time of year is take those plants that were house plants in the winter, and then you put out on a porch or a deck and start transitioning back inside. And that's a really nice thing to do. We do that with geraniums every year. Geraniums are not necessarily a house plant, but they do really well in the house, especially if you have a sunny window. They'll bloom most of the months of the year. Maybe December, January, early February, they won't be blooming so much. But up until that point, and then early spring, late winter, early spring, they'll start blooming again. So that's always a great plant to bring in. If you have a big one in a big pot and you're thinking, I can't fit this in my house, I don't have room for it.
Right.
Take cuttings. You can take cuttings of those now. You can root those cuttings. And then you have small versions of that plant that will grow on through the winter. You could do that with geraniums, with begonias, with fuchsias, with a number of the different kinds of plants that are out there. But for traditional house plants, the ones that you really love, a lot of the ones that are out there now are very adapted to different light levels, which is always a concern with house plants. And one of the groups that I just learned got renamed. It used to be Sansevieria, the snake plant, is now called a Dracaena. I think botanists just hang out in little rooms and they decide to change names every once in a while.
I have one of those, so that's good for me to know that.
Yes, so the Sansevieria, or the snake plant, that comes in so many different versions now. It's not just that tall, spiky plant that you see, but there's smaller versions, different colored versions now, easy to put on top of a desktop, in a window. And the great thing about them is they don't need a lot of water, they don't need a lot of light. You don't even have to notice them. They just are happy to be in your house.
Well, I'm happy that they're happy in my house because sometimes that does not happen. So I appreciate it so much and appreciate our callers. Thank you so much for calling in with your questions. Charlie Nardozzi is our horticulturalist and host of the Connecticut Garden Journal on Connecticut Public Radio. Always a pleasure to have you on, Charlie.
Thank you for having me, Kat.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. Thank you so much for listening and happy planting.